Well, good morning. We will get underway here. There's still have several online and one running late, and so a number of things. So you may have some people filtering in as we come along, but we want to get underway on House Bill 2569 because there's quite a crowd on this one. There's 8 testifying in person, and we have 8 written only. So we'd like to welcome you to our meeting. House Bill 2569. You will find that there's a physical note on House Bill 2569. It's found in the 4CS drive for financial institutions and rural development folder. And so you can look at that. It does has a range of what the dollar amounts could be. So it'd be good to read through this as we move forward. And Representative Proctor, I told you, but you won't start right now, but you'll go first because we're not online yet with the other ones. So, but I'd like to start out with a bill brief with our reviser. And David, if you could tell us a little bit about House Bill 2569.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. House Bill 2569, this would establish a new income tax credit for the renovation of 50-year-old or older structures, and also amends the existing income tax credit for historic structures. The bill would enact 2 new sections of law. Section 1 would name KSA 7932, Com 211, and sections 1 and 2 of the bill, the Historic Kansas Act. Section 2 is really the kind of the heart of the bill here. It establishes an income, privilege, and premium tax credit for all taxable years commencing after 2021, in an amount equal to 10% of qualified expenditures incurred for the restoration and preservation of a qualified structure. An additional tax credit of 10% of qualified expenditures may be allowed if they're for the installation of fire suppression materials or equipment. The total amount of expenditures for the credit shall be at least $2,000, but not more than $1 million. A financial institution shall pay taxes on 25% of the interest earned on loans to qualified taxpayers used for expenditures for this purpose. And the tax credit would be allowed to be carried forward for 10 years, and it could be assigned, but it's not a refundable tax credit, it's a non-refundable credit. And no person claiming the credit under Section 2 of the bill may claim a tax credit for the same structure under KSA 7932, Com 211. I will point out where we talk about that financial institutions paying the 25%. If you look at the bill on page 1, lines 32 through 33, it talks about credit unions. That's actually an error in the bill. Credit unions don't pay the privilege tax. They just got inadvertently included, so that's something that the committee might want to consider if working the bill. The bill does define qualified expenditures to mean costs and expenses in the restoration and preservation of a qualified structure that's at least 50 years old. A qualified structure is defined to mean any building, whether or not income producing, that includes residential, commercial, and agricultural buildings, and the qualified taxpayer is defined as the owner of that structure. Section 3 amends KSA 7932, Com 211. That's the existing tax credit for expenditures incurred in restoration or preservation of structures that are on the Register of Kansas Historic Places. The bill adds language to increase the amount of the tax credit to 30% of qualified expenditure if the structure is located in a city with a population of between 9,500 and 50,000, and could also be increased to 40% if the structure is located in a city with a population of less than 9,500 people. The bill strikes language requiring the total amount of expenditures incurred for that restoration and preservation to be equal to $5,000 or more to qualify for the tax credit. Under current law, the tax credit is at 25% of qualified expenditures, or at 30% if expenditures are incurred for restoration and preservation of a structure that's exempt from federal income taxation pursuant to Section 501c3 and is not income producing pursuant to a qualified rehabilitation plan if the total amount of such expenditures equals $5,000 or more. House Bill 2569 would allow the tax credit of 30% for those 501c3 exempt structures to be in addition to the 25, 30, or 40% tax credit, instead of being one or the other, as is in current law. For the 501c3 exempt structures, the total amount of such expenditures does, that $5,000 amount does remain in place. And I can stand for any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions for David? Representative Shu?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, David. No part of this bill at all touches on energy efficiency as part of the improvements made. Any requirement?
I don't believe it specifies energy impress. I think it's just in that restoration cause. I mean, if there are potentially energy efficiencies within that restoration or preservation, that could be, but it does not specifically say that, no.
Thank you.
Any other questions for David? Representative Burkamp?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on the first 25% of qualified expenditures, there's no limit on population for that. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
David, a question for you on the new Section 2 versus the new Section 3. Is the new Section 2 non-historic structures, buildings over 50 years old but not in a historic district, or a contributing structure in Section 3 is a historic building or in a contributing area?
Yes, the new Section 2 does not require that it have to be something on the Register of Historic Places. It would be any structure at least 50 years old, so it doesn't necessarily have to be on the register or anything like that. But Section 3 speaks to being a qualified historic structure, which would be, it's defined as a certified historic structure as by Section 47C3 of the Federal Internal Revenue Code, is individually listed on the Register of Kansas Historic Places, or is located and contributes to a district listed on the Register of Kansas Historic Places. So Section 2 would be potentially a broader tax credit than what's in current law under the 7932(211). It just has to have that 50-year older time frame on the structure on the new Section 2.
So does it say anything, I didn't find it, but about under regular historic tax credits, both state and federal, the state credits you can sell if you want to. Are these only applicable to go against the individual or company's tax return rather than be able to sell them?
This tax credit could be sold or assigned or conveyed. That's actually page 2, subsection E. That's 24 through lines 24 through 34 talks about the ability to sell or assign, and that would be allowed under Section 2 of the bill.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions for David? Thank you, David. Well, does Mr. Brown happen to be online yet? He is. Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and start out with remote is Scott Brown, President, Friends of Historic Preservation and Fairway. And Mr. Brown, I know you're under a timeline, so we will, in this particular hearing on our 8, we will be able to ask questions to each individual after they speak, and we'll just kind of watch our time on it. So, Mr. Brown, I'd like to welcome you to committee, and we will be interested to hear what you have to say.
I am Scott Brown, President of Friends of Historic Preservation, a non-for-profit organization that champions historic preservation in downtown and rural development in Kansas. Our membership includes developers, bankers, consultants, historians, preservation advocates, and downtown development organizations. My colleagues and I have experienced firsthand the economic revitalization and community pride that occurs when we invest in our historic neighborhoods and downtowns. As General Counsel for Faultless, Starch, and board member of several community development organizations, I have assisted with the renaissance of the historic West Bottoms and contributed to several neighborhood development plans, including the Armourdale Master Plan in Kansas City, Kansas. Other Friends of Historic Preservation members have similar backgrounds, converting schools and industrial buildings throughout Kansas into alternative uses such as multifamily housing. The state's historic development community is ready to expand its efforts in smaller cities in rural Kansas, but robust incentives are needed to address the financing and capacity challenges presented by our smaller communities. The proposed language included in House Bill 2569, including the state rehabilitation credit for rural communities and incentives for banks to finance these projects, will enable us to convert our state's historical resources to meet our housing needs while preserving the rich history of our rural communities. I thank you again for the consideration of this much-needed bill. Christy Davis is present on our behalf to address any questions you may have.
Okay, would you prefer the questions go to Christy Davis, whatever they would be?
Yes, sir, if you would, please.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Brown. Very much appreciate your testimony.
Thank you, Commissioner Kelly.
Okay, now we'll go to Representative Proctor, District 41, Leavenworth, and he's kind of the man behind this bill. Welcome.
For either better or worse, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee members, for taking the time to consider this bill. So I do serve the people of Leavenworth. We came to Leavenworth in 2006, and I'm an historian. So, if you've ever gotten a chance to come to Leavenworth, it's like walking through history. It's the first city of Kansas. It's like the downtown is frozen in time in 1890. It's really a neat place. We're business owners, and we also revitalize houses and commercial properties to get them back into use there. And the genesis of this bill is really that our downtown in Leavenworth, just like a lot of smaller towns, smaller historic downtowns, is dying. Too many of the buildings, a tenant leaves, the building falls out of service, and these older buildings deteriorate very rapidly. So we're really on a clock. We're really on a clock to get these buildings back into service and get businesses back in them before we lose our historic downtowns forever. The name of this bill is the Historic Kansas Act for exactly that reason. So to explain kind of what this bill does, I'll tell you a short story of a development I was trying to do in Leavenworth. Me and my wife own a restaurant in Leavenworth, and we wanted to open a second restaurant. And so we got a hold of a property. It was 1889-ish. And it had been a restaurant before, but it had been out of service for about 10 years, and it needed a lot of work. So we went about doing the current historic tax credit program, which gets you a 25% tax credit. The paperwork required to do it is pretty intensive. And you have to get your property approved by the Kansas Historic Society. And they're great folks, and they work with you. But if you're already a business owner and you're already doing a bunch of other developments, you really got to go get somebody to do the paperwork for you. And when we went to get somebody to do the paperwork for us, we quickly discovered that the amount of money it was going to take to do the paperwork was going to be as much or more than it was going to take to that we were going to get back in a tax credit. And so that's really the genesis of this, is creating either additional incentives for the current historic tax program or an alternative smaller tax credit to get more of these smaller projects that don't get as much attention done. For the current historic tax credit, this bill creates additional incentives if you're working in a smaller town. If your town is 50,000 or less, which is about Manhattan or smaller, the tax credit goes from 25% to 30% to make it a little more feasible to go after that tax credit. If your town is 9,500 or less, the tax credit goes up to 40%. So we can get some investment in these smaller downtowns in the more rural cities. If it still doesn't make economic sense, or if your building is not in an historic district, right? Because a lot of our downtowns, nobody's gone through the process of actually registering the downtown as an historic district or making sure their business or their building is a contributing property. They're not qualified at all for the current historic tax credit program. That's kind of another situation for this alternative tax credit. And the alternative tax credit is 10%. If the building, the house, the barn that you're trying to restore is 50 years or older, you can take the 10% tax credit. All you got to do is when you file your taxes, you deduct the expenses for the restoration. There's no filing paperwork. There's no pre-approval. There's none of the stuff that you have to go through to get the more lucrative current tax credit. Another problem that we have in our downtown, I'm sure a lot of folks that live in rural areas have the same issue, is folks will restore the downstairs of the old building because they can get a business in there, but it's so expensive to meet the codes in your city to get the upstairs qualified for loft apartments that the upstairs just go unoccupied and are unused in our downtowns. If we can get more people living in our downtowns, we'll get more people shopping in our downtowns and frequenting those businesses, which will create additional economic incentives to get businesses and get buildings restored in those downtowns. So something this bill does is it creates an additional 10% tax credit if you put fire suppression systems in your building, which is usually the expensive hurdle that prevents people from doing those upstairs loft apartments. The final thing that this bill does is it creates incentives for our community banks to invest in these properties. Going back to that building that I was trying to restore to do a restaurant, you know, we had a sewer line that went from the building to the main that was busted. We didn't know that when we got the building, all the way from the building to the main, and the main was 25 foot down. So my $200,000 project turned into a $300,000 project, and when I had to go back to the bank and explain that to them, they were none too happy. And that's something that frequently happens with these projects, which is why community banks don't like to invest money to restoration of old buildings, especially these smaller projects that aren't getting that lucrative tax credit that can be sold in advance, or the 10% can too, but it's much less likely. So this bill creates some incentives for banks to invest to these projects by allowing them to deduct some of the interest. And so with that, I will stand for questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any questions for Representative Proctor? Representative Burkamp?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your testimony. Representative, did you and your wife go through with the project that you mentioned?
We did, and it's ongoing because it started in the middle of COVID, so it's taken a lot longer than I thought it would. But yeah, we did. But I know a lot of folks that you know, they get a property, they start to do the development, and then they figure out what a hard time it is getting the tax credit, and then the building just sits. And we've got a bunch of those in Leavenworth.
Okay. And then second question, if I may.
Sure.
On the population threshold, so was there any thought to maybe limiting the program for like the extra percentages to like Ross or more rural areas? Because I know for the 40% one, I was just kind of looking through cities online, and I know like DeSoto, for example, has a population of 9,500 or less. Yep. And I think the state might be investing a little bit of money there here before too long. So I was just curious if maybe it makes sense to be a little bit more specific on who qualifies for that higher percentage of percentages.
You know, I welcome any amendments that the committee deems required for this. I saw the fiscal note this morning. And, you know, it's a little larger number than I thought they were going to come up with. I think they sort of assumed that every building 50 years or older in the entire state of Kansas was going to be revitalized, which I support, but probably is not going to happen. I absolutely welcome if you guys want to do some kind of geographic limitation to make sure that we're targeting rural areas, but I didn't contemplate that. I think, I do appreciate you bringing up the point. That's the thing I forgot to mention that I did want to say about the fiscal note. This is going to spur economic development. I think the intangibles that are difficult to quantify, or as you said, Representative, some of the folks that are developing are going to make their building more fuel efficient and are going to have an impact on the environment. Some folks are, going to develop commercial properties, which means businesses come in, sales tax get paid, property tax goes up. So I think some of it's offset. But
Thank you.
Other questions? One that I have, Representative Proctor, under the historic tax credit program as it is now, and since this is limited to historic areas or historic building, would it be the same that if you're going to go in and rehab for the historic tax credits, the building, that you'd have to conform to kind of the history of the building? You wouldn't take a historic building and go in and fix it up and paint it purple?
yes, sir. That's a great question. Thank you for asking. For the, I think it's section 1 in this, or section 2 in this bill, that current historic tax credit for which we increased the incentives to 30 and to 40 for different sized municipalities, they still have to go through the process with the Historical Society as they apply to confirm that they're not changing the historic nature of the building as they do the restoration. For the 10%, they're not off the hook either, right? Because to get the building permit, to get permission to begin the project, you have to go to your municipality. And, I don't know how your town might be, but in my town, if you want to build or you want to revitalize in the historic district, even if you're not taking the tax credit, you have to satisfy the historic committee in my town that you're not, painting your building purple or putting neon signs all over it. So this really leaves home rule intact and leaves it in the hands of the municipalities to make sure that we're not inadvertently destroying the historic character of our downtowns as we're trying to revitalize them.
When you're figuring out how much your tax credit is, I know under the current program, you have to, some things are eligible, some things aren't, and you have to go in and calculate the work that you did, how much of it was an eligible improvement and how much not. Is that the same here? And then if it is, who does that? The building?
Again, for the Section 2 tax credits, that current process still is intact where you have to, it's a negotiation or a discussion with the Historic Society. And the other thing I'd mention is that on bigger projects, when your tax credits are up there towards the $1 million range, the KDOR gets involved and also does a review. But for this 10%, that process, it's any expense on revitalizing or rehabbing or maintaining that building is, you just deduct it on your taxes. There's no, item by item negotiation to say, is that qualified or is that not qualified, which is another reason I wanted to do this, give that alternative to get some of those projects going that wouldn't happen if they had to go through that negotiation.
So that one would be just between you, the accountant, or your accountant, or you and the tax people then, to whether
yes, sir.
You did it right.
Yep. And the only way that examination happened is if you got audited, you'd have to prove that that's what the expenses were actually for in a normal audit process. But if you didn't get audited, it would just be, filling out the appropriate lines on your tax form.
Representative Baker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing the bill. Great bill. So I think in the rural areas where I live, one of the things we might want to do to help hone this down a little bit is to not include single unit housing, single family housing, individual houses, try to keep it more in that historic district, because we do have some single family houses in some of those districts.
Yes, sir. And I figured I'd ask for the world, and if I got New Jersey, I'd be happy. I honestly just was trying to, no offense to anybody from New Jersey. I figured I would put everything that I thought, we could possibly do to restore the historic character of our state in the bill, and then the committee would deliberate and decide, what was fiscally responsible.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Representative Proctor? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair and committee.
Our next proponent is Christy Davis, Preservation, Friends of Historic Preservation.
Good morning.
Welcome.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to be sure to name the folks that I'm representing. I presented to this committee last session on behalf of Davis Preservation, which is my historic preservation business. I'm also here representing Friends of Historic Preservation, and you heard from Scott Brown earlier. He's our new chair. So I enthusiastically support House Bill 2569 because it will allow developers to address needs for housing and small businesses in small cities and rural communities. The bill is consistent with the recommendations I made in a presentation to your committee last legislative session. I'm grateful to Representative Proctor and other sponsors, including my state representative, Dave Baker, for introducing the bill. Over the past 25 years, I've worked as a consultant, advocate, and developer on historic preservation projects in all 105 counties in Kansas. I'd like to focus my remarks on why this bill is so important for economic development in our state's rural communities and on projects that will address a significant housing shortage in many of our cities and towns. In order to make these projects work, developers stack incentives, including the state and federal rehabilitation tax credit. Rural projects can take advantage of the state tax credit, but many are excluded from taking advantage of the federal rehab credit because the federal rehab historic credit is allocated based on an ownership percentage. And most folks don't have the kind of federal tax liability to make that possible. With larger projects, developers can find investors to buy in and take advantage of the federal credit, but investors won't look at smaller projects, which many of them, in my experience, define as a project under $10 million, which is nearly every project in the state of Kansas, rehab project. Even if the federal tax credit investors would partner on smaller projects, they won't take chances on rural projects because the margins are slim on the development of deteriorated buildings with low appraised values. So we're often in rural Kansas, we have projects where, it might take $1 million to bring a building up to par, and when you're done, it might appraise for $300,000. And that's really hard gap to fill. And also part of the reason that we really need an incentive for bankers to finance these projects as well. Rural Kansas communities like mine are ripe for redevelopment. I urge your support for House Bill 2569 because I believe in the future of rural Kansas, and the bill will help bridge a gap on small projects that will revitalize these communities. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions?
I want to address something that Representative Hsu had asked earlier, if I may. It was regarding environmental impacts and sustainability projects. By their nature, redevelopment is more environmentally sustainable than new construction. The amount of energy embodied in a two-story brick building is enough to take my car around the world 4.5 times. So that's the kind of energy that's invested in these buildings. So when we preserve them, we're ensuring the long-term sustainability of properties that we've already invested in our communities, and also in community cores where the infrastructure already exists. So thank you.
One question that I have, Christy, is in the fiscal note on it, it said the Department of Revenue and the Historical Society are unclear on who would manage the older structures tax credit and who would be required to verify the qualified expenditures incurred on the preservation. And it says, in addition, the bill is unclear on who would administer the transferability of the tax credits and what would be included in qualified expenditures.
So for full disclosure, you all know this bill was given a hearing fairly quickly. We have not seen the fiscal note, but I will say that the 10% credit that Representative Proctor is proposing is modeled after a program that the federal government used to have that was eliminated in the 2017 tax bill. And with that program, it was very similar setup where you filed a form with your taxes, you claimed your qualified expenditures, and you got the tax benefit. If you were audited, then that was reviewed, but there was no review with that program through the State Preservation Office or the National Park Service with that 10% credit. It's our belief that most folks who are in a historic district, especially contributors, are going to see the increased, the enhanced rehab tax credit, and they're going to take advantage of that program and follow that process. But there are many buildings that are more than 50 years old that aren't listed that may want to take advantage of that program. But it's modeled after a federal program that was eliminated in 2017.
And I'm assuming that probably the comment in the fiscal note probably referred to when we get into the 30 and 40% credits for historic structures or in a historic district as to who would be responsible to determine it's a qualified expenditure or not.
Yes, I think Representative Proctor alluded to this in his presentation as well, but the intention is that these projects would be evaluated the same way the historic tax credit works now. The only difference is an increased incentive for rural communities.
Okay, and do you have any idea on, has the banking interest credit been in other programs in other states that you've seen?
I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that question. I will say that in my personal experience working with developers and also being a developer myself, we're asking banks to take huge chances when they're redeveloping historic downtowns that we haven't invested in for many decades. I'm working on a building right now that's been unoccupied, the second floor, since 1950. And so these are projects that require a huge investment. And I do see the incentive for bankers to finance these projects going hand in hand with the incentives for developers as well.
Okay, it seems like a pretty rich credit of 75%, but I just wondering whether there was a basis for it. So, okay.
So we're asking them to finance projects that may cost $1 million, knowing that when they're done, the property may only appraise for, $500,000. I mean, we're asking them to take a risk.
Okay. Any other questions? Nothing? I thought I heard something offline, but no. Okay. Thank you, Christy. Our next presenter is Wendy Stark, Research Associate, League of Kansas Municipalities. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, committee members, for allowing the League of Kansas Municipalities the opportunity to provide testimony in support of House Bill 2569. We are supportive of economic development tools that can be used by Kansas municipalities, such as this historic preservation opportunity. The housing crisis in Kansas is not just a small city or large city. It is an issue that is in not in all cities, but it's in both. At the same time, Kansas has a large number of existing structures that could be preserved or restored, and including those are, if you go down a lot of main streets in a lot of communities, there are some shuttered businesses. So we're not just talking about housing structures, we're also talking about businesses. And the cost of new construction is often a large barrier to any project getting off the ground. And while preservation is not inexpensive by any means, it is an alternative and a lower cost alternative for new construction. Specifically, we support the expanding of the exemption allowances for smaller communities. We believe that's a really good incentive. Just for example, for the historic preservation credit itself, for those cities under 9,500, we have 625 cities in Kansas. 588 cities actually are under a population of 9,500. ranging from 8 in Frederick all the way up to Augusta with a population of 9,256. In addition, that 30% exemption for those medium-sized cities, which is about 28 cities in the state of Kansas, we think that might be an incentive to help some of these communities that are more of a medium-sized community. And so with that, we support any economic development tools that help enhance our Kansas communities and urge the passing of 2579 favorably. And with that, I can take any questions.
Any questions for Wendy? No? Thank you, Wendy.
Mr. Chairman.
Our next proponent is, I'm not sure which I have, Sean and Nikki Tiffany listed. I know you're in person, so, and I assume you're Nikki
I
then.
am Nikki, yes.
Welcome.
Thank you for having us. Chairman Kelly and members of the committee, thank you for investing in the future of rural Kansas. I'm here today to voice my support for House Bill 2569. My husband, Sean, and I, along with our family, own and operate Tiffany Cattle Company, a cattle feeding and marketing service with 3 locations near Council Grove. We believe that preserving our state's rural communities goes hand in hand with conserving the tallgrass prairie, one of the world's most endangered cultural landscapes. The pandemic has reinforced the importance of community and the value of our small towns. Our rural downtown is a symbol of community, character, and history that draws people to Council Grove. When you see your community through others' eyes, you begin to realize that you have something that's worth investing in. That's what we've done. Excuse me. When we purchased the Peyton Jones building in late 2020, most of the building's second floor had been vacant for over 50 years. Now we're rehabilitating the building to address a need for housing, flexible office space, and meeting space within our community. Downtown development in rural Kansas presents unique challenges. In some places, as mentioned, a downtown commercial building costs less than $5,000, but overcoming decades of neglect can cost hundreds of thousands. In small towns where resale values don't match up to the expense, this creates a financial gap. We urge your support of House Bill 2569 because these places matter. And regardless of the challenges, our communities are worth investing in. Thank you for identifying a need in rural Kansas and working to find a solution.
Thank you. Any questions? Representative Baker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nikki, thank you for coming today, and thank you for investing in Council Grove. I tell you, it's been very, very encouraging to see what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years with some of the buildings that are being restored. We've seen more progress in the last 3 or 4 years than we saw in the last 30 years. So kind of turned the ship around in a hurry with some commitment, some investment, some like-minded people like you. The energy has certainly increased immensely. It's nice to go out on Saturday afternoon and see cars on Main Street and people waiting to get into the stores. So anyhow, thank you. So what's been the biggest surprise as you've gotten into this? I kind of know the history of that building. People need to understand in Council Grove in the 51 flood, all that Main Street was 12 feet underwater. And you know, everybody went in and cleaned that up. And you know what happened the next night? It rained again and flooded them again. And a lot of people said, that's it, forget it. And so since 1951, a lot of those basements have not been cleaned out. So I guess on the building you're doing, which is only a block away from the Neosho River, what did you learn in your basement?
Well, I think they hold many secrets, but we've uncovered, actually, my husband has essentially hand dug the basements again and carried off almost 30 truckloads of that river dirt and silt that has settled over those years. And, you know, as far as this process goes, our greatest surprise, I guess, would be that the integrity of the original buildings, the structure itself is in such good condition. The rest of it is worth putting the effort behind. You know, there was mention of plumbing and sewer and ventilation, and currently we have about 3 inches of baking soda on our floor in the main level because we're trying to preserve the tin ceiling and restore that with special technique that sandblasts with baking soda. There's so much to learn, so much history to uncover, and it is just not cheap. So we really encourage the support of this bill and hope to be able to have other people do the same and invest more, especially in those upper stories to create the opportunity for people to move back home and live rural again and thrive.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for a second time. So you're building an event center.
Correct.
So I don't understand that, because you might as well know I'm old. And that's, the only thing I do understand is that's a neat old building. But I don't understand what you're doing at this event center. Can you kind of walk me through what all you're going to do inside that building? It looks like an awful lot of money for that deal, but then I'm pretty slow.
Absolutely. So our building will be multi-purpose. It will be an event center for the community, but also a business center through the week. So we will offer flexible workspace, co-working, if you're familiar with the term, Monday through Friday, to give remote workers, commuters. Council Grove sits in a unique geographical location between the major cities, so people who are traveling through can stop and have a conference call or meet with clients. But as far as the event center goes, the past 2 years have been very difficult for everyone across the state, but there is a draw to gather again together, and I want to provide that space, and then also the service of facilitating a wedding or a family reunion, a gathering of any kind. But we hope that by having the original building in downtown, that there will be a draw for people to come back to that space and utilize it really in the best way they see fit.
So are you getting some interest in events like weddings and things like that?
Actually, statistics show that 2022 will be the largest year for weddings since 1984. I was born in 1980, so I don't know what happened in 84 to create such a surge, but most couples have postponed their weddings to wait until the time is right to gather again. So I have nearly every month has a wedding booked already, and we're booking into 2023 before we are even ready to open our doors. So yes, it's quite a bang for a rural community to be able to host out of town and local.
So I guess my point is, it's got to make money. And it looks to me like,
yes.
And if anybody can figure it out, the Tiffany family can figure that out. I know you guys. But that's really the bottom line. It's wonderful to restore these old buildings. It's nice aesthetically to see them, but somewhere they got to make money and be a contributor to the local economy, and it looks like you're getting that figured out.
Absolutely. One other element to the building is that we're having one portion Airbnb room or vacation rental room, and then the other two units upstairs will become full-time apartments. And so we hope to be able to attract young couples or perhaps teachers to the downtown area where they can walk to work still and enjoy the flexibility and beauty of our rural community and live affordably.
Thank you, and thank you for doing that. There's a lot of pride, and it sure shows. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, thank you very much, Nikki. Appreciate you being here. Our next proponent is Trisha Purden, Director of the Office of Rural Prosperity, Department of Commerce. Nice to have you up this way, Trisha.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Drove up this morning, a beautiful sunrise coming across the plains. Thank you so much, committee, for having me here again today. I'm not going to go through my entire written testimony that I provided, but I want to highlight some of the things that were already brought up by some of the other task members, and really to give a perspective from a local economic development and a rural economic development perspective. I don't know how many projects I worked as a local economic developer that promptly died at the point of putting in fire suppression systems on the second floor, or promptly died to the point where they thought, the city requires us to do all these things that's going to put it above the threshold for the existing building code versus the new building code. And if there's a way to cover that gap, more of these projects would be completed on time than those that have promptly died or have taken 3 to 4 years to complete versus getting it done in 12 months. The state of Kansas has amazing programs with our partners like Network Kansas, with historic preservation, and these entities can help put together stacks for financing for these projects, but often still come up short. And we've talked about this, I think, even in this committee, of this appraisal gap that affects our rural communities. If you put in $500,000 or even $1 million into a building, especially in a rural community, you're not often going to see the appraised value of that property come out high enough for any bank to finance the project. You're always going to end up hitting that wall, even if you utilize programs like Network Kansas that really are amazing programs that are almost on a handshake. I know they're not, but they feel like it sometimes. We get these projects done, but there's usually always still that gap that's higher even than a 5 to 10%, private investment into a property. So that's one of the reasons I would say that this project is really beneficial to our rural communities. I will also say that I think it provides, like Christy had mentioned before, a larger carrot, for the lack of a better word, for investors to look at rural communities, especially our rural downtowns, to invest in our communities and invest their dollars and utilize these tax credits in a way they hadn't done before. I would also like to see the opportunity that this could bring with pairing with the Upper Story RHID program that was put into effect last year. I could see this being a part of that stack to do upper story housing across rural Kansas, revitalizing our communities. And as one of the other speakers before had said, bringing people back into the downtowns of our rural communities. This was made obvious with the Block 22 project in Pittsburgh. When you bring young folks to live in those loft apartments downtown, suddenly you see those young folks staying in town even after graduation. They stay longer, they get more involved, and they open their own businesses. So in turn, does create an economic opportunity for all of our rural communities. The last piece I wanted to say is that this opportunity for investment really opens up new opportunities for small business development in our downtowns as well. Without the lifeblood of small businesses in our downtown communities, municipalities don't see the kind of tax returns, returns on investment that they might see for the infrastructure and other pieces that are going into rural communities. So when the private sector invests in a downtown building, you see a win-win on both public and private when you see these kind of new tax credits offered to a local developer or a local building owner. Lastly, we'll see, we had over 200 applications for the Historic Economic Asset Lifeline program at Commerce. I would say a majority of every single one of those projects I saw could take advantage of this program. This program would be potentially the gap that we weren't able to fund across the state of Kansas and maybe help get some of those dollars back into these communities and get those buildings that are critically needed to be refurbished and revitalized, and would answer that gap that hopefully in the next cycle that we hopefully do with HEAL, we'll be able to put this with that and go a little farther with dollars to help rural communities. With that, I'm open for questions.
Questions for Trisha? Representative Burkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have 2 questions, if that's okay. Thanks for your testimony. I've heard this a couple of times now, so just curious, how much of a hindrance do you think local city ordinances are to rural development? I've heard a couple of people say it adds quite a bit to the cost. So I don't know if that's part of the issue when we're looking at some of this.
So I'm not an architect or a planning official, but in my experience working in economic development, there's 2 different types of building codes a community can follow. And then there's another type of code that doesn't exist for a lot of our rural communities. They don't have a building code, for example. In those communities, they're having to hire outside architects. They're having to follow some of these things that the state fire marshal will come in and maybe put into place and cost more. For those that do have building codes, you have the existing building code and the regular build and the new building code. When you have an older building, it usually falls under the existing building code. But if you improve that building a certain percentage, and again, I'm not an architect, but if you improve that on a certain percentage, suddenly you're being pulled into the new building code, which drastically increase your costs. We had a project that died. It would have been, I think, 12 new apartments in a downtown. It was a 4-story building in downtown Independence that I worked on. And those apartments never were finished because they couldn't afford to add the $60,000 it was going to cost to put in the fire suppression system. Because they put in new drywall throughout, suddenly it switched it from an existing building to a new building. So.
Thank you. And then second question is, do you know, and maybe you don't know, I'll have to track this down elsewhere, but the amount of credits that Kansas has issued, like in cities versus rural areas over the last, since 2016, like since this program's been in effect? I'm just curious what the numbers on that look like and where the money's actually going to, if it's really going to rural areas, if it's more centered on urban areas.
You know, I really don't know, but that's a great question. I would happy to look it up and get that back to you.
Yeah, if you could, I'd like to know that information.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Other questions for Trisha? Trisha, question, looking at this program, and I can see some benefits it has for sure, but it is looking at the fiscal note, could be a fairly expensive program. Would you picture that if, I mean, right now the state credit is 25%, and for cities, this is populations less than 50, 30%, and less than 9,500, 40%. Would you see that if those were slightly reduced, that it would still be an incentive in a rural area, or is it?
Yeah, just like the representative had said before, I think any amendment that still keeps this intact would be a great addition. I think that when you have a very rural community of population less than 9,500, any tax credit above that 25% threshold is going to be an improvement upon it. Like the other representative had said before, there's a gap that 25% doesn't quite cover if you're a small mom and pop. So having something that's higher than 25% is certainly a benefit. I think 40% was a great number to go after. I think the other factor that you're thinking that the committee should consider is the fact that, at least in Southeast Kansas, I will say, you often see those downtown buildings appraised at no more than $30,000. 30, maybe 60 if it's 3 wide building and 2 deep. That's my experience. And if you improve those buildings and suddenly you're able to push that threshold, the property value of that facility is likely going to increase significantly. And so then over a period of time, the tax dollars will come in to pay for that increase, and then would probably balance out with the state budget. Now, again, I'm not an accountant and I'm not an architect, but that would be my experience working on local economic development and local government.
Okay. And are there any other programs that you've come across in other states that would follow the same type of setup?
Yes, and I don't have it in front of me, but I know that this was one of the things that was brought up in the state housing assessment. If I remember right, I think Wisconsin and Iowa have something similar. I'll have to go back and double check that, but I remember when I talked with the rural prosperity officer for the state of Wisconsin, she had mentioned that they have a higher incentive for historic downtowns because we had been talking about our HEAL program and how I think Wisconsin is looking at copying that program, and I wanted to copy her program. But so I know that there are some other states that are doing something similar for the more rural areas.
Baker?
Thank you. You know, it's kind of a nationwide trend to see people move back downtown.
Absolutely.
So I think and I understand the question on dollars, but you know, it's an investment. And it's in order to keep these towns viable, we put the money in the infrastructure. My goodness, we spent lots and lots of money on different projects in these communities. I know in our local community, the amount of money we spent on flood control since 1951. All those things, the investment's been made. We don't want to let that investment get away. And I guess my thought process is the amount of dollars this program will return itself pretty quick as those communities become viable. And I know in traveling around Northeast Kansas and seeing a lot of those communities, boy, there is a demand for people that want to live close to downtown. And I went to Kansas City, the Power and Light District. I saw the attraction there. It's alcohol. You know, and I get that. People don't want to get a DUI on their way home, so they just stumble downstairs and go. But I think we need to look at the new way of the changes. And I think this program is one of those that helps incent that change, and I think we're headed in the right direction. So thank you.
Trisha, thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you here soon on another one. Our final presenter, proponent, is Alex Orrell, Senior Vice President, Government Relations, Kansas Bankers Association. Alex, welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. Good to be before you again. For the record, I am Alex Orrell on behalf of the Kansas Bankers Association. It's good to see everybody again on a Monday morning after a football game. Thank you for the opportunity to submit proponent testimony today in support of HB 2569, which would enact the Historic Kansas Act to incentivize investment in buildings older than 50 years. This legislation does create an economic incentive for developers and investors outside the urban centers of Kansas for the project to invest and help spur economic activity in communities where activity necessarily isn't as strong. I appreciate the previous conferees and their testimony. They're the ones with the boots on the ground and really doing the work in these communities, working with our bankers across the state, and I commend them for their efforts. They're doing everything they can. I know they work hard for their communities. This bill would allow for the flow of additional capital to be available for development and allowed to be incentivized at the bank level. I do appreciate Representative Proctor's comments on the community bank side of this. It's not that we don't like to lend to these certain projects. It's just that the fact and the reality of the situation is that they can be extremely risky. He mentioned the project went from 200,000 to 300,000. That does affect the ratios of that loan. It affects the whole long term of that, and it just makes it a little risky. And so it's not that we don't want to. Trust me, we want to work with every single one of our customers if they have a plan to make their dream come true, and if it allows our businesses to succeed in those communities, we're going to do everything we can. We recognize that this bill. We recognize that there needs to be a mix of policies to help with these issues, specifically in our rural main streets. A lot of our rural main streets, our community bank is the anchor in those communities and supporting those businesses and those customers. And any piece of legislation that helps promote and grow those communities is a good thing. A couple things on this legislation that I'll mention. I do appreciate the tiered approach. It does take a focus on the rural communities and does incentivize there depending on the population. Like I already mentioned, the tax incentive, it is a rich incentive. But on these loans, we're talking about loans that aren't currently being made. So this could be a piece that makes these loans get on the books, spur economic activity. And yeah, there is a tax incentive, but there also is taxes being paid on loans that aren't on the books now. So that's a good thing for the state. This is a big tool for our rural main streets that could be long-term. As Representative Banker said, we put in a lot of significant capital investment in a lot of these rural main streets across our state. If we can help revitalize those and bring those back to life, that is a good thing. This legislature has done many things in the past year. I heard previous conferee talk about the previous legislation about vertical development. That is a great tool. This could be worked hand in hand with that as well. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And when the committee looks at this bill, there might be some tweaks to it, as always with all legislation. But I hope you look at 2569 favorable in consideration. But I appreciate your time, and I appreciate this committee's work in looking at this very good piece of legislation.
Any questions for Alex? Representative Watzinger?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate Kansas bankers and other credit unions, what banking institutions, I think we continue to do the same thing and nothing changes. So trying this is a really good opportunity for the state of Kansas to maybe get people to come back. And they're beautiful, beautiful buildings. I have one major problem with this bill. I bought a house that's 100 years old, and I fixed that up all by myself over the last 20 years. So that's the only problem I have, is I didn't get to take advantage of it. But seeing these really lovely older homes turn out and be used and loved by families is a plus anywhere you live in Kansas. So thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And our last proponent is Kenneth Bateman from Leavenworth.
I want to thank the committee for allowing me the opportunity to testify today. I want to thank the committee for allowing me the opportunity to testify today about House Bill 2569. My name is Kenneth Bateman. I'm a business owner and property owner in Leavenworth, Kansas. Specifically, I have experience developing a property in one of the historic districts in Leavenworth, and I also own a historic stone home in the city. Older buildings, both commercial and residential, are rapidly falling into disrepair in the state of Kansas. House Bill 2569 creates powerful incentives for the effective allocation of capital focused on repairing, upgrading, maintaining, and utilizing buildings within the state of Kansas that are vastly underperforming. However, bringing these buildings back into serviceable conditions, including complying with modern building codes, is very capital intensive. House Bill 2569 provides a unique combination of incentives to facilitate the rejuvenation of these properties. It does this through two methodologies. First, House Bill 2569 modifies the existing state tax credit system. Currently, the Kansas State Historic Tax Credit Program allows for a 25% state tax credit for qualified improvements on a qualified property regardless of location. This blanket approach for the entire state fails to effectively target this incentive to our smaller communities where redevelopment and historical preservation projects will have the biggest impact. House Bill 2569 addresses this issue by increasing the tax credit on these projects to higher percentage levels based on a city's population. In cities where the population is less than 9,500, the tax credit is increased from 25 to 40%, and in cities where the population is between 95 and 50,000, from 25 to 30%. This change provides a meaningful incentive for a person to engage in rehabilitation and redevelopment in the cities where the impact can be the most significant. House Bill 2569 does more than allocate tax credits under the existing historic tax credit, but creates a three-pronged approach to addressing the need for improvements in housing and commercial development. As background, it is worth noting that last year, the Kansas Housing Resource Corporation and the Office of Rural Prosperity launched the state's first comprehensive housing needs assessment in nearly 3 decades. Page 14 of the executive summary of the Kansas statewide housing needs assessment states the issue clearly, quote, most of the housing stock across Kansas is older than 1960. Attention to poor housing conditions is critical to maintaining the largest asset in the state. House Bill 2569 addresses this problem head on. First, House Bill 2569 creates tax incentives for the rehabilitation of older properties, not just historic ones. House Bill 2569 does this by creating a new 10% state tax credit for improvements on commercial, residential, and agricultural buildings over 50 years old, which are not covered by the historic preservation tax credit. This is a very strong incentive for owners to improve their older properties and address poor housing conditions, including upgrades that will lead to more energy-efficient homes. This incentive has the potential to make a significant impact in the communities across Kansas that are most at risk for deteriorating housing condition. As an example, on the same page cited earlier from the Housing Needs Assessment, it states that in Montgomery County, the median year of housing structures, meaning the median year that those houses were built, is 1957. And in 2020, 9.94% of the county's housing conditions were rated as poor or below. Strong incentives are needed to address poor housing conditions, and a 10% state tax credit is just that. House Bill 2569 requires that the improvement be over $2,000 but shall not exceed $1 million. This allows everyone from an individual homeowner to a small real estate company to take advantage of the tax credit, but effectively puts the limit on the cost of the state of Kansas by having a reasonable maximum of tax credits in a specific year. These tax credits would also be available to commercial and agricultural properties, ensuring needed upgrades are made to the oldest structures to prevent deterioration. The second prong of the approach is the creation of a 10% tax credit related to the installation of fire suppression systems in buildings that are over 50 years old. As you may know, many downtown commercial districts have buildings which predate the 1950s and in some cases the 1900s. Such buildings are generally packed tightly together, creating a risk of fire spread from one building to the next, absent fire suppression systems. Concerning fire suppression systems, a key benefit is that once it is installed, it remains with the building. It's a permanent feature that's long-lived, long-lasting, and can provide decades of protection regardless of ownership turnover. We should encourage the installation of these long-lived assets that provide benefits to the community over time. And finally, House Bill 2569 grants a very powerful incentive for financial institutions to reinvest in local communities by allowing a substantial deduction against interest earned on loans that are used for expenditures on buildings over 50 years old or for the installation of fire suppression systems. As you know, the availability of capital is a key factor in the development of all real estate. Buildings that are over 50 years old may require substantial rehabilitation, and loans associated with these assets may be viewed as more risky than other types of loans by financial institutions. Thus, the goal of this provision of House Bill 2569 is to, from the financial institution's perspective, match the risk with the reward by lowering the bank's taxable income. In summary, if House Bill 2569 were to become law, it would provide powerful incentives to encourage private sector investment in the rehabilitation of older structures, especially as it relates to housing, as well as create an environment where capital is made available by financial institutions to facilitate improvements. I would like to thank the committee for allowing me to speak today. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I didn't know I'd be last, and a lot of this stuff would be talked about before I got up here. So
it makes it all a common thread then when we hear it. Any questions for Mr. Bateman? Okay, Representative Hsu, a question for David.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is just a kind of a clarifying question based on something that Representative Wasinger said. So for the 10% portion of it, the definition of qualified structure, is there also a pre-existing definition for building? So basically, I'm just trying to clarify, single family houses are not included in that definition of building?
It did say residential, so it would be. And I would think that's where you would want to focus a lot of the repairs.
So any building older than 50 years old in the state of Kansas would be eligible for this new 10%?
That is how it is currently written.
Okay, that seems like a lot. And I don't know that that's necessarily the intent of what we're trying to do here, but thank you for the clarification.
Any questions for Mr. Bateman? Thank you very much for being here.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
This shows all of the oral proponents. Anyone else wish to testify as an oral proponent? If not, we'll close the oral portion, open the neutral portion. I show no neutral testimony. Anyone wish to testify as neutral? If not, we'll close the neutral, open the opponent. I show no oral or written opponent. Anyone wish to testify as an opponent? If not, we'll close the opponent section of the hearing, and we will close the hearing on House Bill 2569. And we'll move into our second bill of the day, and it'll be shorter. House Bill 2622 was, want to show, it was canceled for today, and that was enacting the motor vehicle financial protection products provision, and we had a call from those involved with that, and they are continuing to work towards a compromise on 2622, so I think we'll see it back, but appreciate it, them calling and indicating that they would rather have things lined out before they come to us. So that one will come here in hopefully not Wednesday, but maybe Monday of next week. So now we'd like to open the hearing on House Bill 2623, enacting the Rural Remote Worker Incentive Act. And the fiscal note can be found in the committee drive under the Purden folder. And the bill brief, David, could you tell us a little bit about House Bill 2623?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2623 would enact the Rural Remote Worker Incentive Act. This act would be under the administration of the Secretary of Commerce. Section 1 provides the name and citation of the act. This would be 5 new sections of law that would be enacted. Section 2 is the definition section of the act. We'll point out that remote job is defined as a full-time, permanent, remote, or mobile employee who works from such employee's residence or other space in a rural area for 30 or more hours per week. That would not, the term does not include any part-time, temporary, or seasonal employee. Rural area is defined in the bill as a city with a population of 60,000 or less, and a county with a population of 80,000 or less, or any county with a population of 40,000 or less. Section 3 establishes the incentives and requirements for the incentives. Business would have to create a minimum of 5 net new remote jobs in rural areas to apply to the Secretary of Commerce for the incentives. All remote jobs would have to be at least 30 miles from the business location. The minimum wage for a remote job shall be equal to or greater than the county median wage where the remote job would be located. And in making the application to the Secretary, the business would have to provide a copy of the business's quarterly wage and unemployment tax return form that is submitted to the Department of Revenue, or any other evidence that the Secretary would require as provided by rules and regulations. Subject to appropriations and upon approval of the Secretary, the business would receive a cash incentive payment of $4,000 per net rural remote job created. The total amount of incentive payments shall not exceed $600,000. So the aggregate of all incentives paid out would not exceed $600,000. And this does also provide rules and regulation authority to the Secretary to implement and administer the provisions of the Rural Remote Worker Incentive Act. Section 4 creates the Rural Remote Worker Incentive Fund in the State Treasury. The fund would be administered by the Secretary of Commerce or the Secretary's designee, and all expenditures from the fund would be for the purpose of making those $4,000 cash incentive payments in accordance with the Act. Section 5 provides that the incentives under the Act would be in addition to any other economic development program administered wholly or in part by the Secretary of Commerce, such as, they could utilize this act in, say, like the PEAK program or any other economic development program. It would be in addition to, not exclusive. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I can stand for any questions.
Questions for David? Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, David, for that breakdown. The remote job shall be at least 30 miles from the business location. Is that the business headquarters, or is that any business location that they have?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's a good question. A business location is defined in the Act, and it means the physical address where a business conducts business operations, and that could include headquarters, a branch, or a satellite facility. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be the headquarters. It could be, if they had a branch, it would need to be 30 miles from that location as well.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions for David? Thank you, David. We'll open the proponent portion of the hearing, and reappearing for her second time today, Trisha Purden, Director of the Office of Rural Prosperity, Department of Commerce. Welcome back, Trisha.
Thank you again. I appreciate you letting me speak to you twice today. I'm excited about this bill for multiple reasons. The growth and prosperity of rural Kansas is our sole job at the Office of Rural Prosperity. And thinking through opportunities and programs that could be created to help support the revitalization and repopulation of our rural communities has been at the forethought of our process since 2019 when we did our rural listening tour with, at the time, Lieutenant Governor Lynn Rogers. During that tour, we learned more and more that this is one of the top issues, along with housing and childcare, that every one of our rural communities is facing, with the exception of a couple that luckily saw some increased population in western Kansas. House Bill 2623 creates an innovative program that leverages our remote rural workforce in a way that really has never been seen before. With every pandemic or every disaster, there has to be a silver lining, right? So with the pandemic, we saw unseen growth in technology and the use of remote work across the state of Kansas. We've witnessed how people can successfully utilize their skills and talents at home to get their jobs done, whether or not they're reporting into a corporate location in a city or in the city center. So rather than traveling to the office or meeting, you jump on a Zoom or a Teams call, and you can do any work for anyone in the world. Our work no longer has to be connected to a city or a building in a downtown community, but can be done anywhere, especially in rural Kansas. We've seen this again, repeated again in our Kansas Power Up and Go report. We heard from several individuals, especially young professionals, who maybe have moved here from cities like Chicago or New York or Miami and have moved to enjoy the rural lifestyle of Kansas, but yet are able to work remotely and bring home salaries from companies that normally would never be accessible to someone living in a rural community in Kansas. This rural remote worker program will capitalize on urban business wins by encouraging those expanding and new businesses to hire rural Kansas. So it doesn't just improve our rural communities and increase potentially population in our rural communities, but it also takes every economic development win we're seeing in our more urban areas and allows our rural communities and the citizens in our rural communities to take advantage of these wins as well. We've seen things like this happen in like Salina or Wichita, where we've seen massive expansions happening that were announced in 2020, and we would like to see that capitalized in our rural regions of Kansas as well. One of the things that I want to make sure we point out, which I think is really vital, and I think Representative Baker pointed out last time I came to talk to you, was setting that threshold for what categorizes as rural. And so for the classification that's in this bill, we wanted to make sure that this follows the same framework as our upper story RHID and the RHID program. So that's why that population is set that way. But it also takes advantage of our communities like, I'll use Salina for example, that are rapidly growing and we're seeing economic prosperity, but often have businesses or employees that are working 30 miles away in more rural areas that could work for a headquarters location in a community like Salina. We want to make sure that our expanding businesses also can take advantage of this. Oftentimes we see new incentives for new businesses, and this one really provides for existing businesses as well. So when John Deere in Coffeyville expands and they want to hire engineers, they could also hire engineers that live in Caney, Kansas, 30 miles away, and they could work remotely, for example. The wage for the remote job also must be equal to or more than the county median wage where the remote job is located. I think that's another critical point of this bill, is it does allow for higher wages to be realized in more rural areas. I know oftentimes you see a perpetual higher unemployment rate in rural areas than you do in urban areas, and it's mostly for that lack of well-paying jobs. They're competing for these jobs, and maybe the jobs that they're skilled for, often a trailing spouse, can't find the position that they're looking for, but this would provide that opportunity. We're excited to see that this program really could be the game changer that puts together all the pieces that we've already talked to you about today and in previous sessions. We know that Kansas continues to have a high migration rate. Kansas is the 6th most moved from state in the United States. This would be the #1 reason that these people are leaving is because of employment. So if we're able to offer new jobs that people can capture all over the world, but stay in rural Kansas, we're more likely to capture those students graduating from our Kansas high schools and our Kansas colleges and keep them in our state. It's a new innovative program. It capitalizes on our trend of remote work. It keeps people in our state. It's capturing outside wages, which will improve our rural communities, increase property tax revenue and sales tax revenues in our rural communities, and which will all have a positive economic impact. So I urge you to pass HB 2623 as a new way to sustain rural Kansas, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have for me.
Thanks, Trisha. Questions? Representative Hsu?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. I'm just thinking this through, and I appreciate what we're trying to do here. I do think this is a trend that we do need to capitalize on, but the thing that I'm struggling with is I am unsure that the right path to take is to incentivize Microsoft, who is going to, who is going to be remote no matter what, or some of these big companies are going to be remote no matter what, and giving them $4,000 and for, maybe no real reason, these people might move to rural cities anyways. I wonder if maybe the $600,000 might be better used as marketing for our rural cities to say, hey, Microsoft employees, you're in Seattle right now, maybe, you do want to live in Salina or some of these smaller communities. So, I'm conceptually not opposed to what we're trying to do here, just trying to tinker in my brain on what the best avenue for that is.
I think that's an excellent point. In fact, I had a similar thought of jobs that are guaranteed going to be remote regardless of whether or not that headquarters is in Kansas or New York. I think it's an interesting point, but I think it also is an opportunity for us to capture those high-paying jobs that are working for Microsoft and normally would never locate. Those employees would maybe never locate in Kansas. Those are the types of businesses that, yes, probably do not need the incentive, but it's also the types of businesses that pay extremely well-paid employment numbers and salaries for rural workers as well. So I completely understand what you're saying. I don't have a solution to fix that, but I think it's an interesting point to bring up.
Representative Baker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again for being here. So in kind of a footnote to that, these jobs come in, those jobs are W-2 income.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of difference there because as an independent business person, I seldom pay income tax because I lose money every year. So I love the incentives and they really help me. But the guy who pays has a W-2 income, he's one that carries the load. And I guess on this bill, that's the group we're going after. We're going after the people that are actually going to be paying the taxes. So just a side note there.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Representative Poskin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question. So in the case of a company like Microsoft or something, is there any requirement that they pay a remote employee who lives in Kansas on the same pay scale that they do somebody who lives in Seattle?
That's not written into this bill.
Mm-hmm. I just think it's an interesting thing to maybe look at.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Other questions? Trisha, a couple questions for me. On one, $600,000 is the max, is it? So if you go, my thinking, and I mean that 40,000 population is in here because, so it really conflicts with the other 80 or 60. But if you want the 600,000 to go as far as possible, the 40,000 was the thought that those are RAWS counties and they're rural counties. So if you have a county of 80,000 with a town of, 60,000, whatever, you could eat up some money pretty quickly and not end up with a lot of it available to go out to the rural area where we're trying to pull people in. So that's one thought that I had on it. Now, is the is your $4,000 a one-time payment? So if you set up that job and it's rural, and you get $4,000, say, for 2022, you don't get $4,000 for 2023 for keeping it there. So it's just a one-shot.
Yes, that's correct. It's just a one-time incentive.
And so how about the 30 miles? I mean, I suppose it wouldn't go. I mean, some people drive 30 miles to work in the city. That could they be a remote worker and the company gets $4,000 for letting them not drive to work, or do they have to be out in a rural area?
Well, the way this bill is written, so the location would have to be permanently based remote. It wouldn't be a position that, a couple days a week they come in, but they would be remote worker only. And they could be, a town of like Osawatomie, for example, could come in and work for a city in Overland Park. Could potentially be why that 30-mile radius is in there. So you could capture, Miami County and some of those surrounding areas that certainly are rural, but definitely are within a commuting distance of a business.
And that'd have to be a job that's established after the bill goes
Yes.
into effect. So, okay. Any other questions? Thank you, Tricia.
Thank you very much.
On our bill, we have one other proponent, written only, and that was from Wendy Stark of the League of Municipalities, written only. So that's all I show. Anyone else want to testify as a proponent on 2623? Not, we'll close the proponent, open up the neutral. I show no one. Anyone wish to testify as neutral? I see no one. And we'll close the neutral portion, open the opponent. I show no oral or written testimony. Anyone wish to testify as an opponent? If not, we'll close the opponent portion and we'll close the hearing on House Bill 2623. On our next meeting will be Wednesday. We will have final action on House Bill 2268, and we'll also look to see if we're in a position to work either of these two bills on next Wednesday. So if you would, I mean, there were some good points brought up on things that may be potential things to look at on amendments on both of these. And so if you have any thoughts, you might get those down and work on those. But we will stand, if there's nothing else, for the benefit of the committee from anyone. Representative Wassinger?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In order to sound like a broken record, it gives blanket rules and regulations to the Department of Commerce. And I would like to add an amendment to that as well, to make sure that there's some legislative oversight. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other? If not, we'll stand adjourned.